in aggregate, a whole bunch of people engaging with content that's very sensational, very provocative, that's where you start to see political extremism content getting a lot of engagement and pickup from the crowd, from people just like us, which makes the algorithm decide that it is something worth showing to still more people.
Well, I am delighted to welcome as my guest today, Renée DiResta. She is the author of Invisible Rulers, which will be our topic today, and also Associate Research Professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown. Renée, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I enjoyed your book and learned a lot from it. Thank you for putting the effort in. I have to tell you, the thing on page, I think it is 18, you wrote something that had me saying, I'll read it. It is possible that if you are reading this book, you have at some point in recent years asked yourself, is it just me? Or has everyone else lost their mind? And I felt like saying, because not only do I wonder about that, but everybody that I know says that too. They say, it's like there is some sort of contagion out there. And so you are an expert on the internet and on social media and its effects on all of us. So I think it would be helpful to begin with a story that you tell. And I want to go back to how you got involved in all this. But first, let's set the stage with that story you tell about the difference between the Iowa caucuses in 2012 and the Iowa caucuses in 2020, because I think it sort of illustrates how in that short interval, the way we process information, everything had changed. So tell that story if you would.
Yeah. So in 2012, you had a Republican caucus in Iowa, and I am trying to remember, it went through like 3 different wins, right? I think there was Santorum was declared the winner, Romney was declared the winner. There was a third person.
Well, as my recollection is that Romney was declared the winner, and then later it turned out that Santorum was actually the winner. But by then, Romney had already gotten the boost and all that, and
yes. And I think that there had actually been a third person who had been.
There might be. I don't remember that part.
It was a really complicated story, and actually, one of the interesting things was like researching it and trying to piece together from the news coverage at the time, because this is in the days sort of prior to social media really being a major factor. It wasn't the be all end all of political communication at the time. It sort of moved into that sphere. But I was going back and I was like pulling the articles, and they're having such genteel conversations about it. There's not an assumption of malice. They don't immediately leap to like the deep state rigged it for whomever. It was just very much like elections, things happened. And what happened in 2020, so hard to remember the different elections at this point. What happened in 2020 was Pete Buttigieg unexpectedly won that caucus. And he did not have quite so much of a center of gravity on platforms like Twitter at the time. Bernie did, Elizabeth Warren did, Kamala Harris did. There were a number of different people who were in the primary who were, who had almost like fandoms that were like indicated by an emoji. There was an emoji in your bio that told people like you had this rose, you loved Bernie, et cetera, et cetera. And Mayor Pete won. And this led to a whole bunch of Democratic Party folks and kind of political influencers who were supporting other candidates, saying there's no way this is real, this was rigged. And then they discovered that there was the tools to new software to kind of measure the votes in the caucus. They had not sufficiently tested them. It was made by a company, I think, named Shadow Inc. or something that just sounded something like right out of a movie. And so there was just this massive outcry on the internet about how this had somehow been rigged, because I think that they accused Robbie Mook, who had previously worked for Hillary Clinton, of having some involvement with this app. And then he had to come out and say, I had nothing to do with it. But people were alleging that like the Clinton family was behind this win. They wanted a neoliberal to win, not a progressive. And the whole thing was like, it was a mess. And it was just indicative of this deep suspicion, right, that had kind of descended upon the political ecosystem at the time. This question of like, how can we possibly trust a win when our guy doesn't win?
Right. And the culture that had grown up on the internet in those intervening years was one of deep distrust and conspiracies and all of that. So you first became aware of this effect, I guess, when you noticed that there had been a measles outbreak in Disneyland. So you're from California, you had a son who was starting school, you were thinking about vaccinations. And tell us about how you discovered this sort of underground world of rumors and misinformation.
So I'm actually from New York, and I had just moved.
But you were living there. Sorry. Yeah,
no,
yeah.
This is actually kind of relevant though. The reason I corrected that was because in New York, there are required vaccines for school. And the way that you could get out of that was with a religious exemption. And it took a lot to get a religious exemption approved in New York. This was not so much a thing. So then I moved to California in 2011. I had my first baby in 2013. And then in 2014 is the Disneyland measles outbreak. And there were measles exposures on BART, which was what I took to commute to work every day. And I had this son who was too young to be vaccinated.
Right.
And so I found this kind of ridiculous. Why do we have measles outbreaks in California in 2014? And I was looking at the policies. I was also trying to put my kid on the wait list for the preschools there, this stupid process you have to go through. And as I was doing that, I pulled down data from the California Department of Public Health because they put out transparency reports about what the vaccination rates are in various schools, in the kindergartens and in some of the preschools and daycares. And I realized that over time, you could pull down 10 years of data. So I actually did this quick analysis to see what the trends were like. And there was the rise of this thing called the personal belief exemption. And so unlike New York, in California, to get out of vaccinating your kid for kindergarten, you just had to say, I don't want to vaccinate. And that was it. Your personal belief was enough. And I thought this was really kind of wild, actually.
Yeah.
The idea that you could just put other people's kids at risk by deciding that you were going to opt yourself out of the social contract. And so I did get involved as a pro-vaccine mom, saying, how do we grow a movement of pro-vaccine parents who say, look, there are certain areas, like seatbelts or insurance or other, these other areas where we say, collectively, we have chosen to take this action to participate in this social contract. And why we're just allowing these opt-outs. It was a little bit wild to me. And what I found as we tried to grow this pro-vaccine parent movement was that the anti-vaccine movement was already incredibly well established. And it was this example of kind of an asymmetry of passion was the term I used for it. Just this idea that people who do not spend a lot of time in niche communities on the internet tend to think that everybody is sort of, thinks like them or, believes the same things they do. And since vaccination rates are usually upwards of about 85%, people just go and they get their child vaccinated and they don't think twice about it. They just go and they do it. But people who don't want to vaccinate spend an inordinate amount of time telling you that, right? Producing content on social media so that everybody knows. And so it was, whenever you had searches for vaccine content on Facebook, it was almost exclusively anti-vaccine content. Same thing with Twitter, because they were actively out there evangelizing their position, and the pro-vaccine kind of normie was not. And so I wrote a little bit about just how they had created and built these networks over time and what it would take for pro-vaccine parents to essentially replicate that dynamic, how challenging it was actually going to be because nobody wakes up in the morning to tweet that the earth is round, but a whole lot of people will wake up to tweet that it's flat. And that's that disparity really becomes a challenge when algorithms are returning what's available to them.
Okay. Algorithms. I have never really felt that I understood algorithms. I'm not sure even at this time that I do, but I think we need to talk about those. They're a big part of your book. So you describe a guy named Guitar Guy, and how he, through this process of algorithms partly, becomes drawn, even though he begins only interested in posting about playing the guitar, the dynamics and what is built into the system. Actually, you quoted somebody from the Atlantic as saying the internet is built to empower extremophiles, and you use the example of Guitar Guy to show how this happens. So, can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I think that was Helen Lewis's article. She was pointing to this very real phenomenon, which is that when you exist in an online environment where content is curated for you, right? You are not sitting at when you open up an app, Twitter, Facebook, whatever it is, only rarely, if you're looking for something specific, do you go and type something into the search bar, right? So what you're going to engage with instead is like what appears in front of you when you open the app. And that's a process called curation, right? So curation algorithms are looking at all of the different sort of vast universe of posts that they can show you, and then they're ranking them for your feed, and then they're showing them to you. And they have to decide what to show you. So what are the different criteria? Well, that might be, you engage very, very frequently with somebody. It might be that every time they show you a video from this one particular page or creator, you leave a comment, right? You've communicated that you want to see more things like that. But sometimes what they're doing is they're actually surfacing things for you that they want to show you to create a sense of like spontaneity. This is actually one of the things that TikTok is known for. It's called unconnected content. So you have not chosen to follow that person, but some recommender system has decided that a sufficient number of people like you like that content. And so it's going to show it to you. And so there's this constant process of things being picked out of millions of available posts for you to see. Now, the creators who make that content, the influencers is the term I use in the book, or content creator, influencer, they know that their view count, which directly impacts how much money they're going to make on the content, is dependent on how often their content is shown to people. So they're constantly trying to produce content that is for their human audience, but also for the algorithmic curator. Because if the algorithmic curator doesn't show their post to people, if it picks stuff from a different influencer, then they're going to have lower views. And so there's this constant.
But the algorithmic curator is a machine, right? It's not a person.
Code, right? It's just code.
Right.
Yeah.
It's code. Okay.
So
the financial incentives are to get engagement.
And for the influencer, it's to get engagement. For the platform, it's to keep you on site. So the platform wants to show you things that you are going to engage with because that's what's going to keep you on their app. So if I open up TikTok and I see videos that are very boring to me, I can really easily go to YouTube or I can go to Instagram and I can get videos there too. And if one of them has a better curator, a better recommender system, then I'm just going to open up that app. So the platforms are in competition with each other for user time because they all make money by showing you an ad that's kind of interspersed within that feed. So the platform has its incentives. And then the content creators who are investing all of this time making content also want to be paid, right? For many of them, this is their livelihood. And sometimes they want clout. Sometimes sometimes they're looking for money. There's different motivators, but they have to get their content in front of people's eyeballs. And the algorithm is the thing that is going to make that possible.
Okay, but how does that interface with political extremism?
Mm-hmm. So if you're putting out a nice neutral conversation, people might like it, right? Some audiences might like that. But if you're putting out something where you're getting into an argument, there's a brawl, there's a moment of like you owned your enemy, there's a clip, like a 5-second clip of you dunking on somebody or saying something crazy or being provocative, that is one of the things that gets a lot of engagement. So when people see that content, the way that the audience figures into this whole process, anybody looking at social media, is when we click that like button, that sends a signal that this is something that other people might want to see also. And in aggregate, a whole bunch of people engaging with content that's very sensational, very provocative, that's where you start to see political extremism content getting a lot of engagement and pickup from the crowd, from people just like us, which makes the algorithm decide that it is something worth showing to still more people. So there's you can think of some of the big sensational accounts, right? Libs of TikTok is one of them, where their entire shtick is going and finding something that's weird or, a person who who will seem ridiculous to their audience, and then they'll put that out there, and it gets a ton of engagement because it's sort of like red meat for that particular crowd, and so they'll engage with it. And so we're constantly reinforcing that this kind of sensationalism or mocking is the kind of content that we should see more of, and in turn, the incentive system continues to chug along.
Okay, I understand that we as consumers, one tries not to be this way oneself, but, we feed the appetite for conflict.
Yep.
And that's interesting and engaging. Okay, I get that. What I have a harder time understanding is the proliferation of complete BS and nonsense and, the Wayfair story. Tell the Wayfair story. And,
that was, so there's a kind of an online conspiracy cult called QAnon, and we can talk about how QAnon formed, but it was basically through recommendation engines connecting a whole lot of different conspiratorial communities, kind of putting them all in one place. QAnon was very heavily recommended by Facebook to other.
By the way, that's another danger of this whole infrastructure,
exactly.
Right?
Because the algorithms are amoral. They don't know, right? They're not.
But they do have this tendency to pull together a lot of conspiratorially minded groups and people.
Well, and that's because, there's a saying you hear: the best predictor of belief in a conspiracy theory is belief in another conspiracy theory. And that's because if you have a particular alignment around distrust, right? I don't trust the government. They're lying to me. Well, if the government is lying to you about vaccines, then you're more likely to, if you believe that the government is lying to you about vaccines, you're probably more likely to believe that they're lying to you about what's coming out of the back end of an airplane, or what's coming, or what FEMA is doing, or any of these other different topics. If you distrust the government, there's a whole proliferation of theories that are rooted in that distrust that you might be receptive to. And QAnon was one of them. So in the Wayfair story, there was this QAnon influencer, and by influencer, I mean a person in that community with a lot of followers who got a lot of uptake when she put out posts. And one day she said, I've been shopping on Wayfair, and it looks, how are these filing cabinets so expensive? So she's looking at these industrial grade filing cabinets, they're around the $10,000 range. She finds this anomalous. And where she goes with this is that must be a trafficked child. So a lot of these products have human names. If you've ever gone on like anthropology.com, you'll see that they have like the Jenny curtains and the Amy armchair, and the way that products are named, a lot of them have human names. And so she decides that these industrial filing cabinets that cost too much money, she thinks, and have human names must be you procuring a child. In the early days of QAnon, it was very focused on this idea that children were being trafficked, and this was being kept from the public. So a lot of the QAnon researchers, as they called themselves, went to try to find evidence of this conspiracy theory. You have to think about it as like, people aren't starting from the evidence and arriving at a conclusion. They've formed their conclusion, and they're looking back through the internet for evidence to support the thing they already believe. So if you see it in that light, then the idea that this filing cabinet costing too much money and having a name maybe plausibly, you can see how they make that leap. And what winds up happening is this begins to snowball. And that's because you can go to your local missing persons page and you can type in a name, you can search it, and then you can take any name and go type it into Wayfair, which has millions of products, and you will find a match. And so people began to do that and to make these collages that they would put up on Twitter saying, hey guys, I've never paid attention to conspiracy theories before, but this one really looks real. And so they're tweeting about how Wayfair is trafficking children. And this leaves Twitter with a little bit of a challenge, right? Because first of all, people who are seeing this becomes a big trend. People who are seeing this begin calling actual hotlines to report missing children or information about missing children to report this Wayfair conspiracy theory. So you start to see some of the organizations that are responsible for actually saving trafficked children saying, please stop calling us about Wayfair. It becomes a problem for them. You see threats to Wayfair and their executives. Things like, well, we've got to go down there. Wayfair winds up having to hire armed guards. And Twitter is there with this problem of, do you let the trend continue or do you nuke it, right? Do you prevent it from happening? And this is where you get into the challenges around free speech, right? Free expression. How do you balance the right of people to do this with the fact that these are photos of real kids, some of whom were runaways and have since come home, and they're out there making proof of life videos saying, I'm not trafficked, I'm not in a filing cabinet, I'm here and I'm fine. And the response to that is, your captors must be making you make this video.
Oh, God.
So all of a sudden, these kids are then getting harassed and people are trying to dig through their lives to find evidence that they're still trafficked. And so Twitter does nuke the trend. And, this was in 2020 that this happened. Mm-hmm. And the question of how would X handle it today is a really interesting one, right? Because now that action has been reframed as censorship, not as moderation. And so part of what I try to do in the book is walk through why the policies evolved in the way that they did and what they were trying to mitigate, which was in this case, essentially the doxing of kids and the threats to the company and the flooding of the child safety lines. But now the sort of pendulum has swung back to, we can't take that down or interfere with it because it's what the people want to discuss.
Yeah. So in the book, you go into history. You talk about rumors, propaganda. You spend a lot of time on Father Coughlin from the 1930s, who abused the medium of radio to great effect until he was stopped. Spreading, for those who are unfamiliar, spreading really kind of very vicious anti-Semitism and eventually pro-Nazi propaganda. And he was stopped by a combination of influencers of his own day, and the church itself finally put the kibosh on his radio broadcast. But I want to ask you there's always been a tendency among people to believe crazy things or to believe dangerous things. The supermarket tabloids, for as long as I can remember, have had these crazy headlines, woman gives birth to 6-headed baby and whatever. But in the pre-internet era, you'd see these things on sale at the supermarket checkout line, and you'd roll your eyes and you'd think, well, people are buying these things, but they're doing it for the entertainment value. They don't actually believe this stuff. But in the era that we live in now, I don't know, you keep saying throughout the book, people's psychology has not changed. What's changed is the technology. And I wonder, are you sure?
I remember my grandma, who really was, she didn't read in English particularly well, and she would actually read she came from Italy. She would read Star, the tabloid Star, because it was sort of for her this novelty of celebrity gossip, lots of pictures, and it just kind of tied into her watching talk shows and things like this. And I remember that that she would periodically bring it home, and I remember my dad being like, "This is such garbage, why do you read this?" And she would say, "Leave me alone. I find it fun." Right. And I think about that a lot because it was this this dynamic where for a lot of people, it was like an escapism almost, just a source of entertainment. They didn't take it so seriously. I think one of the things that has happened as far as a change is that our politics went from being something that was not necessarily in your face at all times, but on the internet, you spend so much time performing your identity, right? And particularly on a platform like Twitter, where what we were talking about before, you put literally the emoji of the politician you're supporting in your bio. Not everybody does it, but a lot of people do. And you have people who are interested in advocacy causes. They'll put a bike, right? That sort of transit people will put a bike in their bio, the housing people, a little house, and it's indicating this is a thing that is really important to me. And I am here to talk about it. And I'm here to persuade you. Or, in the worst case, intersection with human psychology, I'm here to harangue you until you leave, And so it's not just passive entertainment that you consume by yourself and maybe talk about with a few friends. It becomes the thing that you do all the time. And there's a much more performative aspect to it, much more communal aspect to it also, by which I mean when we talk about Amazing Polly of the Wayfair story,
she was the influencer who started the rumor.
Who started the trend. But all of these other people participated too. And that's because it was fun for them, right? First, they thought they were doing something important. They thought that they were finding trafficked children. I think people really need to realize that these are not just pretend beliefs. They are, like, a lot of people really, really believe the stuff that they are out there putting out on the internet. The anti-vaccine activists, absolutely true believers, right? This is not just performative. And so they see this as their opportunity to take an action that matters. And so that I think in prior media eras, you still had truthers and conspiracy theorists and things like that, but it wasn't quite so integral to the identity. It wasn't such a communal process of discovery, and it wasn't something that you were putting out and performing at all times. And those are the shifts that have really happened. Plus, as you noted, the technology in the form of like the algorithmic assist that takes your theory about kids in filing cabinets and makes it possible to reach millions of people with it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it also might be, couldn't it, that people had their private, like, weird ideas in the past, and they didn't necessarily get any reinforcement for them from their family and friends. In fact, they might have gotten a little bit of pushback, you know, that's like your father and his mom.
Yep.
Right. But on the internet, you can always find people to ratify your craziest theories.
Yep.
Okay. So yeah, that can therefore change psychology a little bit, or at least its expression. It can allow our less rational sides of our minds to come to the fore.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Let's talk now about some of the things you point out about the way this all works. You talk about influencers. We've talked about them. We talked about algorithms. Let's talk about crowds. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So explain the importance of crowds. And how it works online as opposed to in real life.
So the influencer is only an influencer because they have amassed a following, right? That's what makes them the influencer. And the way that they will often do this is by appealing to a very specific niche, right? In the age of mass media, you were trying to reach as broad an audience as possible, right? You were speaking perhaps to all of America. There were independent pubs, of course, but overall that was the goal.
That was CBS, NBC, all those old media.
Old media. But what happens now is if you want to be influential, if you want to grow an audience, you're going to start by appealing to a niche. So maybe you're a mom and you're going to appeal to your fellow moms. So you're going to put out content that appeals to moms. And then the audience is, amassed in part because sometimes an algorithm surfaces the influencer and then they start to follow. Or you have groups, right, where people will go to Facebook or something and they'll look for a group. And when I had my first baby, none of my friends had kids. And so I wound up joining a bunch of Facebook groups so that I could, figure out how to take care of the baby, right? And so, so you find this this community, and oftentimes the way that the crowd grows on Facebook, it's very much you go looking for something and you kind of immerse yourself in it. There's this crowd psychology theory that says that that's called a closed crowd, right? A community, almost like a church membership maybe, or a club, and online it might be a group, like a Facebook group, versus an open crowd, which is more just like people who spontaneously come together. And Twitter is much more for something like that, meaning something trends on Twitter, you click on it, and even if you've never heard about that person before, you're going to go and all of a sudden you're participating in a topic of conversation with all of the people around you. Maybe you know them, maybe you don't, but it's an opportunity to all of a sudden be like a member of a group with a particular interest in a particular moment. And that might dissipate, but ultimately it's an idea or a theme or something that's just brought people together. So the power of the crowd is sort of twofold. One, they're providing signal to the algorithm. The reason something is trending is because a whole lot of people are engaging. It doesn't just magically happen. It happens because a whole lot of people take an action, right? So the crowd is influencing what the algorithm curates. And then the relationship between the crowd and the influencer is really important. And that's because the influencer is appealing to this niche. And if the niche decides that she doesn't represent them, that she's not kind of like either ideologically pure in the realm of politics, or maybe she says or does something that alienates some percentage of the audience, well, they can leave and they can go find another influencer who is interesting to them. So there's this phenomenon that we call audience capture, where the crowd begins to sort of pressure the influencer. Hey, cover this person, talk about this thing. If you remember around like October 7th or BLM, you'll see crowds of people saying, why aren't you speaking out about X, right?
Everybody who is on the internet gets the complaint.
You're not talking about
you didn't comment on X, on whatever the thing that I'm interested in is.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so and that does create pressure. I mean, you have a podcast, you have an audience, you're speaking to a particular community. And so there's that question of what are you willing to alienate your audience on to speak the truth versus where is it easier to say nothing or go along, right? And that's, I think, in the realm of political influence, that becomes a really big driver where you see people seemingly like kind of veer off down a rabbit hole. And this is, per the early question you asked me, like, why is everybody around me going crazy? This is where you get these things like, why is this person who I followed when he was a writer at such and such now such a complete lunatic? And then you look at the audience and you realize that, this is a case of audience capture. He needs those subscribers there. And being the most extreme avatar of their opinion is the way to do that.
So you came up with a phrase, I think it's original to you. I love it. People have created their own bespoke realities. And that's great phrase. So I have a question about the whole algorithm thing, in that, could we outlaw them? I mean, like maybe the EU, which has taken a much harder line on regulating social media than we have, as I understand it. And would it do any good if we did?
It's an interesting question. So there's this concept of like expressed versus revealed preferences, right? Where what people say they want and what they actually want are not always the same thing. Mm-hmm. Some platforms will let you switch your feed between reverse chronological, which means you're just seeing all of the things, all the people you've chosen to follow in a reverse chronological feed. So just, from most recent to least recent, you can just scroll and scroll and scroll. And so it's not curated in quite the, to quite the same extent. But here's the thing that happens there. First, if a lot of people, maybe 1 out of every 10 social media posts is interesting. So without the algorithm to curate the best ones, it feels a little bit boring, a little bit slow. Or you're creating an incentive for people to post constantly because they want to be at the top of that reverse chronological feed. So instead of surfacing like the one good idea they had that day, it becomes like a deluge, right? It feels a little bit spammy. So even this very, very theoretically neutral dynamic of a reverse chronological feed doesn't necessarily have the impact that people want it to. So it's not curated.
Wait 1 second. I've got to interrupt you. You say the one good idea they had out of 10.
Yeah.
But does good mean provocative, controversial,
question, right? Yeah. There's, do you remember like the early days of Facebook, people would post like, I ate a sandwich. Do you remember that sort of like, it was,
I wasn't on Facebook very much.
I was like right out of college when they opened it to like the plebes who hadn't, gone to the Ivies, but it was, it was people just posted like, I'm at this party, I read this book, I'm talking to this person. And that's because it still felt manageable. You only followed your friends. And so maybe you cared about those things. But if you're following hundreds of people, do you really want to see every idle thought that they have? It doesn't necessarily create an experience. So when I say good, I should caveat that can mean many different things to many different people. And we'll talk about that in a second. But for the platform, it's, does this experience keep people here? So they have an incentive that's not the same as ours. But as far as like what
couldn't they just go by likes and responses to show whether it was good?
But that again depends on like who's seeing it and when. So that signal is coming from a whole bunch of, some people are seeing it through the For You feed. So again, it is going to level up things that are more sensational. But I think what you're getting at is something that I think is important, which is platform and user incentives can often be very, very misaligned. And the user is put in a position of adapting to the incentive of the platform, right? We all think that it's very normal to be outraged on social media because that is what happens, right? Because we are so caught in these outrage machines and engagement bubbles that we have come to feel that that is normal. It feels normal to scream at people, right? This is a thing where, I mean, you must get like the random replies where somebody's like immediately hot right out of the gate with some sort of like caustic misinterpretation of a thing
All
you didn't even
the
say.
damn time.
But it's so normalized. This is how you engage, right? And so some of the research that's happening now, some of the experimentation on newer platforms like Blue Sky, is giving users much more granular control, where you're not saying, okay, reverse chronological means I'm going to be met with this sort of deluge. Some people might want it. Honestly, most people don't. Most people just don't engage with it. And the platforms know that because they have that data about what the revealed preference is, which is the For You feed. But for people who do want to find something else, I think Blue Sky is really interesting because you can choose specific topics. Like I might go on and I might want to see parenting content or completely apolitical content. And I can just click a little feed at the top of my, my screen there, and it'll show me that community in that moment. And if I want to go back to, let's see what the rage bait of the hour is, like I can get that too. So it allows people to see, I think, what else is possible. And that's what I find so appealing about it. And I think that Meta is now trying to do this on Threads. They've also just in the last week rolled out that possibility where if you give users more control, I think the question that we're going to see answered through this kind of natural experiment is, what do people actually go and do, right? Do they keep going back to the rage bait, or do they start to engage more in these these areas with more granular possibilities?
Ready to optimize your nutrition this year? Factor has chef-made gourmet meals that make eating well easy. They're dietitian approved and ready to heat and eat in 2 minutes so you can fuel right and feel great, no matter what life throws at you. Factor arrives fresh and fully prepared, perfect for any active, busy lifestyle. Lose up to 8 pounds in 8 weeks with Factor Keto meals. Based on a randomized controlled clinical trial with Factor Keto, results will vary depending on diet and exercise. With 40 options across 8 dietary preferences on the menu each week, it's easy to pick meals tailored to your goals. Choose from preferences like Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, or Keto. Factor can help you feel your best all day long with wholesome smoothies, breakfasts, grab-and-go snacks, and more add-ons. Reach your goals this year with ingredients you can trust and convenience that cannot be beat. In our family, my husband and I both compete to get to the Factor meals. He grabs them on his way out the door to take for lunch at the office. I try to have them at home. Eat smart with Factor. Get started at factormeals.com/MonaCharen50off and use code MonaCharen50off to get 50% off your first box, plus free shipping. That's code MonaCharen50off at factormeals.com. So there's another related topic to the one we've discussed, and that is the decline in trust of experts. And we've seen, this isn't just an internet phenomenon, and we've certainly seen that it's a decline in trust of all institutions in American society that's been going on for decades, actually. But it is really, it came to the fore during COVID, where you had people, online deciding that they trusted, QAnon influencers or whatever more than the CDC. And I thought you had something really different to say about this from what I usually see, which is you point out that in this era, when people are perpetually online, the real experts, the people who know things, absolutely have to be out there responding and communicating better. And that's just a feature of the way we live now. You want to talk about that?
So I had during COVID, I was at Stanford Internet Observatory and also like from my house, right? We were all in there, constantly on our couches with our phones. And I was looking at just narratives around COVID in the very, very early days, early 2020. So from December 19, when those of us who looked at China, which I did, realized that this was going to be a thing. And what you saw was institutions that were qualified to figure out what was actually happening, meaning, is this airborne? Do fomites carry it? How do masks work, right? These sorts of questions were largely reticent. And that's because they're moving on a very different timescale, right? They're moving on a timescale where they're doing research, they're doing an experiment, they're gathering data, they're communicating with counterparts on the other side of the world, et cetera, et cetera. But what fills the void is whatever the commentariat on the internet says, because we're all scrolling our phones. We're all looking for something. And when you search for a term, that question of what comes up, oftentimes it's going to be the thing that's most popular. So you have the institutional bodies both not speaking, all right, until they're 100% sure. And even then, things change a week later, but they're still waiting to try to be absolutely sure before they say the thing. Oftentimes they look like they're leading from behind. Before the CDC mask guidance comes down, prominent people on the internet have been telling people, hey, you should be wearing masks, right? And this, of course, will flip later, where some of the same people who were pro-mask early on become egregiously anti-mask when all of a sudden they feel that it's, like an affront to their liberty. But you see, again, that question of like, who is helping people make sense of the world? It's the people who are speaking where the public is. And the other thing about it is, we talked about virality and how it's people sharing content that triggers that algorithmic boost and, gets content out there more. The CDC doesn't put out very engaging content, right? It puts out like a PDF, a fact sheet, a link, go to our website for more information, right? So it's not somebody who hops on a vertical video with their camera phone and says, hey guys, there's this thing I've been seeing, you should check it out. It's a completely different style. And so what is going to get surfaced? What is
Listen, if it's me, I am much more likely to trust the PDF than somebody with their cell phone saying, look what I found. That woman who was watering her lawn and noticed that the sun was making rainbows in the water and said, that's not normal.
I know. I really do. I really get it. But what happened in that time, I don't know how many people know this or paid attention to it, but like Twitter found itself in this really interesting position because it felt obligated to surface accurate information. Now, again, platforms get to curate however they want. They have legally their own First Amendment rights to do that. This is another reason why when you were asking, like, is there a way to just regulate it away? Really, no, right? So you have this, platforms get to curate and surface and, host accounts and so on and so forth in accordance with their preferences. And so what Twitter chose to do at the time was it tried to quickly credential frontline physicians. By credential, I mean to give them a blue check mark. And to elevate their content, right? To up-level their content so that more people saw it. So it was curated again. And it was sort of like privileged curation to try to surface content from frontline physicians who were talking about COVID during that moment in time. And one of the challenges that those physicians had was that many of them just did not have a very visible presence. They were competing with influencers who already had millions of followers, because they're random political commentators or random wellness commentators or random mommy bloggers or what have you. But those people have the influence. And so influence and expertise are just not in the same, like they're like decoupled, I guess is a way to put it. Where when you're competing for attention as a way to make information reach people, the people who know how to play the attention game are going to get the attention. And the people who are producing very factual, dry, nuanced content are probably not going to be as good at getting that attention. And this is the problem that we find ourselves in on so many other topics. But I chose to use COVID to illustrate it, to try to get at this sense of like the stakes, but also to help people realize that people really moved into very divergent realities depending on who they followed at that point in time, as conspiracy theories about vaccines and other the mark of the beast, that there was snake venom in the vaccine, all these different crazy theories. That kind of stuff got so much more lift than the content that was being put out by the health organizations.
So these days, X under Elon Musk would not do the kind of responsible thing that Twitter did in the day. And so, really feels a little bit like Gresham's law: the bad drives out the good. And I do have trouble understanding how people who are otherwise making rational decisions in their lives, like if somebody in their family comes down with, I don't know, cystic fibrosis, I guess you're born with that, but, comes down with a brain tumor. I mean, they are not going to go to Polly on the internet to find out how to handle it. Well,
you'd be surprised.
If they do, God bless.
No, there are a lot of this, because this is, the conversation about what do you do about health misinformation is a really fraught one. And that's because it has become synonymous with vaccines, and vaccines have become synonymous with, like, again, it's an identity marker at this point, that you can see the sort of political divergence in appreciation for or trust in vaccines post-COVID. Like the stats are pretty clear. But early Facebook health misinformation policies were not written just about vaccines. It was because there were a lot of groups that were pushing, for example, cancer quackery, right? Do a juice fast. Your oncologist is trying to kill you. Chemotherapy is poison, right? And these different narratives that were happening in Facebook groups where, again, people get a new diagnosis. They're horribly upset. They don't necessarily, the mortality stats and the information on the internet is very frightening. So they go and they try to find a group of people who are going through it. And so much of this question of, like, what direction you go is what are you aligned around, but all, like, kind of innately. But if you choose, if you experience distrust in the medical establishment, then that wellness influencer looks really good, right? Here's a trustworthy person talking about how, like, she healed herself using healthy, natural things. And unfortunately, what happens is people decide to put their trust in that. And so for Facebook, this was a question of, again, people have agency. They can go and they can find it. But one of the arguments that I and others made over the years, starting in around like 2018 or so, is this freedom of speech, not freedom of reach dynamic, which basically argued that recommendation engines didn't have to suggest this stuff. It didn't have to proactively push it out to people. And that's what it was doing. You would join a cancer group, and then all of a sudden you would get recommended a ton more cancer groups because the algorithm would realize you were now in this, in this realm of people who wanted cancer content. And so they would just surface the most engaging groups, the most active groups, as opposed to the most reputable groups. And it really started to lead to problems of people having bad outcomes because they were, in their, like, vulnerable moments, they were receiving these types of suggestions. And the platform ultimately decided that there were certain kinds of health information that it was not going to proactively push to people. They would stay on the platform. You could go and join them, but the platform wouldn't do the lift, the heavy lifting of pushing it to people.
And why can't they do that about election misinformation?
They absolutely can. They can do it. And they were doing it for a while, right? They were, again, in 2020, Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and all the rest had these, like, election integrity portals where they would just try to surface, when something was, people were alleging that there was, like, a voting machine irregularity in Arizona. They could surface that in their portal. They could surface the response, because election officials are administering elections. They're not trying to be influencers on the internet. So that problem of they only have 1,000 followers, most of whom are there to yell at them, really. Because again, like, your normal average person is not like, I really need to follow my local election official. They just go and they vote and they trust it. So this weird disparity, that weird asymmetry of passion is there too. And again, in 2020, the platforms were very much doing this. They were labeling content when something was misleading, like when Trump said there is massive fraud. They left the post up, to be clear, but they put a label on it that said, for more information, go here. Or
that's right. I remember that.
Right. The factuality of this content is disputed. And you know what happened? That got reframed as censorship. Anything that was remotely inconveniencing to the power of a political machine got reframed with the label censorship. And once it's framed in that way, again, it becomes an identity marker. Like, they are trying to silence you that label is silencing your president, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where you start to see the redefinition of, basic platform curation as some sort of thumb on the scale cabal trying to, keep the truth of the election from you.
Well, and you have personal experience with this. Because when you were at the Stanford Internet Observatory, you participated in analysis of misinformation about voting. And then you heard from Matt Taibbi. Why don't you tell us what it's like to be, because you're writing about all these phenomena online, including, this kind of mobbing of people and harassment and other things that have been supercharged in the era of social media, but you've also lived it.
Yeah.
So talk to us about your own personal experience a little bit.
I've gotten a lot of bullshit inquiries from reporters in my life. You just know this is a hit piece, okay? Like, really, the question is just strategically, what's the best response for you? And I got this really funny email from Taibbi that was like, "Hi, Renee. I know you know about my work because you've written about it critically on many occasions. I want to talk to you about elections. I'm sure, or your work or something like that." He didn't ask any questions then. So after announcing himself, he moved right to, "I need you to comment on the fact that you used to work for the CIA." And I was like,
wait, we should back up for 1 second and just remind people that this is post Musk buying the Twitter.
This is like March of 2023 or something.
And he assigned several people, including Taibbi, to do analysis of how Twitter had, under the previous ownership, had censored people. Okay, proceed.
And so he was going through Twitter's emails. Again, you have a conclusion and you're going to sort of cherry pick your way to validating it. And I've written about that. He was right. I did write critically of his work because I wrote the Twitter files could have been something interesting, right? There could have been a sort of almost like a WikiLeaks style, like, let us put out, appropriately redacted to protect people's privacy, but let us put out the information and a whole bunch of different people can look at it. But that's not what happened, right? It became score settling and vendettas. And at one point, they decided that there had been this vast government cabal to steal the 2020 election. The intelligence community was
for Joe Biden.
Yeah, for Joe Biden, yes. So again, the Trump appointees running the government were in cahoots to steal the election for Joe Biden, is what you're being asked to believe there.
Yes.
And so again, I had engaged with Twitter during the election. We would periodically, I used to engage with them a lot on Russia and China, actually. So there were plenty of emails back and forth between me and the team on Russia, China, and those sorts of topics. But I got this inquiry that was not actually about a single email I had sent. There was nothing objectionable that I had done. Instead, the inquiry was, tell me about how you used to work for the CIA. And I was like, okay, like red flag,
Yeah. Now, you were an intern at the CIA in college, right?
20 years ago. 20 years ago. And this was not a secret either. Like he had found this video where when I joined Stanford, Alex Stamos made a joke about like my secret past at the agency or something like that in a public live streamed YouTube.
Big secret. Yeah.
Like, Renee's big secret. And then implied that the agency had placed me in my job at Stanford. Again, 20 years planning so that I could steal the election for Joe Biden. And so this is the stupid bullshit you're being asked to believe. But the problem is, the true believer phenomenon is so real, right? So the audiences that see him as credible don't see me as credible, right? They see him as exposing me, exposing the deep state agent at Stanford University. And it's really hard to be in that position because you're being asked to prove a negative. How do you prove, no, the CIA didn't place me in my job? Well, I mean, what would you even... It's so stupid that actually when I got that inquiry, I laughed. I didn't respond. I just laughed. And I was like, okay, I really kind of naively didn't think that would be the thing that they would go with. I thought for sure they would find some objectionable sentence in one of the emails I'd sent, but no, they actually didn't even bother to do that work.
No, you became what you call elsewhere in the book
CIA
a
Renée.
main character, CIA Renée.
They kept calling me that. I thought it was really funny. Again, I was like, man, it's like stolen valor. Like I was an intern for crying.
Yeah.
But they kept using it, and that's because one of the things that happens, much like with the Amazing Polly story, and what I was relating about, like those poor kids, right, who once they're put in the collage, they can't say, no, I'm fine, I'm home with my family, leave me alone. That's like, no, obviously you would say that, you got to deny it. And so this is the position that you find yourself in, where you're in this like this bizarro world where I just felt like it was such an exercise in cherry picking to prove the point that at times they did things that I thought were like extraordinarily unethical, like literally cutting an email in half to like reframe it in ways that fit their narrative. And one thing I'll say again in this question of how do you respond, I think a lot of people in those moments respond by saying nothing, by doing nothing. Every inquiry I got after, I posted to the internet and responded publicly and was like, no, we're not, no more courtesy. But at the time, like Stanford, which is a big institution that operates in the way that big institutions do, thinks like, oh, the media cycle will blow over. And I was like, no, once you're a character, right? Once you're in the collage, you never stop being a character. It doesn't just blow over. They use you every chance they get, because maybe you appeared on a webinar with somebody once. Now we've appeared on a webinar together, right? So anything that you or I have done that is convenient to smear the other party becomes part of the narrative. And that's the thing that I think, again, if you haven't, the reason I started posting now when I get hostile emails, like bullshit emails that are just like, we're sending this perfunctory email before we smear you. The reason I post them to the internet now is because I think people need to see how the sausage is made.
So that can segue nicely into some of your solutions and to navigating this crazy world now. By the way, you were then also harassed, I believe, by Jim Jordan. Who was subpoenaing everying that you'd ever done.
We got the whole.
You got the whole thing. I'm sorry for you. But you you have a number of suggestions in your last chapter, and this one did not read, I must say, like the typical last chapter in a Washington book, which is, so where do we go from here? Yours were really good. They were really well thought through and helpful. And one of them, I think you were just alluding to, which is pre-bunking.
Yeah.
Right. So explain that.
It's funny because one thing I'll just say, because I know you know him also, I was talking to Yasha Monk as I was writing it, and he described it as like the chapter 9 problem. Everybody writes a garbage last chapter.
And usually because the publisher demands it, and you're like,
everybody needs solutions,
Yeah, exactly. No, but yours really are solutions, I think.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because I stressed about that chapter, but because you don't want to write something that like is going to be overtaken by events before the book even comes out. But pre-bunking refers to this concept that if you can teach people to recognize rhetoric or tropes, meaning like common building blocks in stories, or just framings that tend to indicate that something is not on the up and up.
Or propaganda in general.
Propaganda, right. So, and actually the technique comes from anti-propaganda efforts in 1933, right, against like Father Coughlin and others that you mentioned, or that I talk about in the book, where there was this effort called the Institute for Propaganda Analysis. And what it set out to do was not fact check what Coughlin said,
right,
but rather to say, here are the kinds of rhetorical tricks he uses to make you feel a certain way. And you can do that still today, because those same rhetorical tricks, if you pull up these documents from the 1930s, I was amazed at how relevant they are to this present moment. And I thought, why aren't we doing this? Why aren't we trying it? Teaching people to recognize that, for example, in all of the last like 12 elections, there have been these rumors of, hacked voting machines or rigged voting machines. And if you tell people you are going to see these allegations, and here's how they've appeared in the past, and in the last, 12 elections or whatever, here's what the actual facts have shown. Like, there's just no truth to this. There are isolated incidents, right, where a machine goes haywire for whatever reason. You should expect that too. Somewhere in the United States during an election, a voting machine will break, right? Yeah. And teaching people to think about it in those terms and then say, like, you might see this, which just puts it into their head that, oh, I've heard that these stories go around. Let me maybe think a little bit more reflectively or critically about it. And ironically, the research into pre-bunking is now being reframed as censorship. So,
of course,
it's government brainwashing. Pre-bunking is government brainwashing. And that's what they want you to believe, right? And again, it's because they recognize, ironically, how well framing and propaganda actually works. And they don't want the public to be educated about it, unfortunately. And so that's just constantly undermining pre-bunking and all sorts of information literacy is, that's going to be the next fight.
Talk also about adding friction.
Yeah. So friction is something that Twitter actually really experimented with in really interesting ways. So there used to be these buttons where, not buttons, like pop-ups, where if you shared an article, but you hadn't read it, meaning Twitter did not have evidence that you had clicked a link, it would say to you, do you want to read the article first? Right? So that's called a nudge. It just says, like, you can still click yes, and immediately it goes right through. But it just is designed to put you in like maybe a little bit more of a reflective state of mind. Another area you see this is like, if you go to make a post that has like curse words in it, they'll say like, not a lot of people talk like this. Is this the tone you want to take?
Yeah, I wish that were true, but.
I know. Well, don't worry. It doesn't do this anymore as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
And so again, it was just this like, could you put people into like a little bit more of a reflective mindset? Is this how you want to express yourself in this moment? So that's what we call like visible friction, where the user knows that it is there. The other kind of friction, which is a little bit more opaque, is things like virality circuit breakers is what they're called sometimes, where if a story is starting to go wildly viral, a platform might limit distribution until it can try to figure out if the thing is real or not. And what all of the platforms have said, or what X and Meta have both said recently, is that they don't do that anymore. They're not going to do that anymore. So that form of like trying to like give a fact checker or someone enough time to assess it, like we're not gonna be doing that anymore. So,
which is a shame, because you analogize it to the circuit breakers in the stock market.
Yeah.
Which is, it's a great safety valve, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and it just gives you a little time. That's all. It doesn't impede anybody's free speech. It gives you an hour or half a day or whatever, for tempers to cool, and for, people's, better natures to assert themselves.
That's the theory behind it. I like the visible stuff. I think it's actually highly useful. I mean, I've definitely changed a couple of posts where I'm like, okay, maybe I'll change that word,
Oh, absolutely.
I see.
Lincoln, before when he would write a harsh or negative letter to someone, would then put it in his desk drawer overnight. Yeah. And look at it again the next morning and rethink as to whether he wanted to take quite the tone,
right?
That he had taken. And I think that's a good lesson. By the way, that feature about, are you sure, you didn't read this? Are you sure you want to circulate it? That used to make me smile, because it always asked me that before I was posting my own work.
Yeah, same. That happens to me a lot too.
Yeah. I would say, yeah, I'm sure. Okay. So any other of the suggestions that you want to highlight? Because then I want to just spend a few minutes on AI before we have to go.
Yeah, I think, the putting people in a more reflective mindset. I tried to break the solutions chapter into like what institutions could do, what government could do, and what ordinary people could do. And I felt like the ordinary people one was the one where there was going to be the most the most potential for pickup. Institutions, I think, my sincere hope actually is that even if they only read part of it, that people who are managing institutions today need to understand what to do when the internet comes for them, right? And I have been thinking about this nonstop since this USAID thing started, right? Where again, regardless of what you think of USAID, the absolute vacuum as far as like counter speech about it, it is so hard to find accurate information about some of the allegations being made, right? Like, oh, it funds the Soros prosecutors. Okay, there's likely that's a inflammatory, decontextualized take, but I can't find the other take. Who is doing that speech? And I think, unfortunately, like my big takeaway from my own personal experience with this was like, Stanford really did it wrong. The institutional reticence, the unwillingness to speak was horrible. And we knew it when it was happening. Those of us who study rumors are like, no, guys, like we really got to be talking here. And I regret that so much. And I want other people to know that this comes for your institution. And you've got to know, you have to have a plan for what you're going to do. Wayfair is another example. I was just with some PR folks, and I was actually surprised they didn't know that case study, because it's like canonical in my part of the universe of like, what is Wayfair supposed to do when that story begins? They opted not to talk for a while as they wait to see what is this really going to blow up? And then by the time it does, you're not in the conversation. And I think recognizing this huge shift in how attention is captured and who captures it means that all of these institutions need to have different plans. So that's the other one I would highlight.
Okay. AI. You talk in the book about some of the challenges, and one of them you mentioned that I hadn't thought about was, so after October 7th, there were, these images that came across the web about the atrocities that had been committed. And then people tried to debunk the images by saying that they were AI generated. And so that one of the consequences of having AI, at all is that nobody knows anything that is negative can now be attributed to AI. And politicians are doing this all the time now. They're saying that I didn't say that, that was AI generated. So how do we cope?
Yeah. This again is the point about being out there and, out there and communicating. If it is fake, just being really upfront about that. A lot of the, in election 2024, a lot of the effort to make people aware of AI and what it can do, both from the standpoint of creating unreality, right? Creating things that don't exist, but also the way it can be used to deny the real. So no, that wasn't my voice in that video. That was AI generated, when in fact it is the politician on a hot mic, right? So trying to make people aware of this, unfortunately, it does come down to this crisis of trust, right? What source do you believe? And we haven't seen it really we haven't seen the mass abuse of this technology or that rhetorical technique in politics. It's not fully normalized. But as it gets easier and cheaper to produce content, I think it is something that anybody, every politician needs to understand. Like, you're going to be asked to, you may be in this situation. How are you going to respond? How do you validate where you were? All sorts of different phenomena. And I think it's also important to note that oftentimes it comes for ordinary people before politicians. So there was also, I think, a faked hot mic of, if I'm not mistaken, it maybe was like a principal, and they the principal school board member, I'm trying to remember the specifics of the incident, but they faked him saying racist things, right? And leaked it as if it had been a hot mic sort of thing. And in fact, it turned out to be fabricated. And there was, after the content was authenticated, there were either charges brought or a lawsuit brought. So this question of like, but in that kind of intervening time, one of the challenges is like, if this is happening in an election scenario, does the public form an opinion before, and vote in accordance with that opinion before the facts can be known?
And if it's a private citizen, they can have an excellent case for libel.
Right.
But if it's not, if it's a public figure, then forget it. What about watermarks? I mean, the equivalent, the internet equivalent.
That too, and for people who want to like read a fairly nuanced take on it, Google put out something that I thought was very good on what it calls assertive provenance, which is like, what kind of information can you give to people about a piece of content? And one of the interesting challenges is that watermarks, it's not always clear like what it's conveying. Is it conveying that an image was AI generated? Sometimes you have what's called AI inpainting, where 7/8 of the image is real and a tiny percent of it is not. One of the things that's been interesting about watermarking is sometimes it will kind of algorithmically applied watermarking will show up where a photographer has used an Adobe AI editor to like remove a lens flare or something. So this question is like, what do we want the watermark to communicate? Because if you see a whole lot of watermarks on totally innocuous content, right? Just, hey, this image of, Obama on the moon is AI generated. Like, obviously, that you don't need a watermark to tell you that. So there's this proposition, I think it's Prop 47 in California, where it's this sign that appears when you walk into a business and it says like some chemical in this, vicinity is known to cause cancer. Right. And the effect of that is everybody completely ignores it.
Ignores them.
Literally, like they're essentially that label is on every business in California that uses like ammonia to wash a floor or whatever, Yeah. And so that's the problem with like, what do you want the watermarking to achieve? What people really want to know is, am I being deceived? Right. Not, is this an AI generated image? And we're less good at answering that question because so much of deception is context dependent, right? Mm-hmm. If I were to show you a picture of, some sort of, you can envision a scenario where something is like made to be art, right? Made to make a political statement where if you know that it's not real, then it actually doesn't matter that it was AI generated versus something that's AI generated and passed off as true and real.
Yeah. So it hasn't happened yet, but do you think we're headed for an era in which AI generated fakes are going to be a serious challenge?
I do think that's on the horizon. I think in part because, again, the crisis of trust means that, did you hear what Zuckerberg said about fact checking in his statement, right? He said they destroyed more trust than they created and they were biased. And this was a shameless political capitulation because Zuckerberg talks about how great they are when he's talking to the European Union and then slams them as biased when he's talking about them here. And that's
only after Trump won.
Exactly. And after, and with full knowledge of the fact that many on the sort of MAGA right have tried to delegitimize the very idea of fact checking for a long time. And that's one of the problems. We're going to see that replicated in the context of AI content too, where people are going to be attacked for for people who try to become validators are going to be attacked as illegitimate, biased, flawed. And you're going to see that same dynamic play out where people will try to create distrust in the entities that emerge to try to do those analyses. And that, unfortunately, the combination of occasional false positives and then delegitimization is going to make it very, very difficult for people to agree on what is real.
Okay. Let's close with the more hopeful side of things, because you do have suggestions. One of them you mentioned in passing just a few minutes ago, namely the way you put everything out. You put out your emails with people so that there's a record, it's clear, it's time-stamped, and you're recommending that for like people in public or in companies or in business or in the government, to sort of insulate yourself from a certain amount of misrepresentation, right?
I think transparency is your best, your best defense.
Yeah. And then you mentioned one more thing, and this one I'm not sure how it would happen, but but you talk about getting that the truthful side of any controversy needs to find its own spokespeople and influencers who can compete in that space. I mean, I guess there's a limit to how much you can ask, Taylor Swift to do.
Taylor Swift. No, it's more, so you can, again, this is the interesting challenge, right? When I mentioned like the election official's job is to run an election, not to be out there speaking, but there's a couple of them, particularly in Arizona, Stephen Richer. He's a great communicator.
He is.
And he knows how to communicate in the parlance of the internet, right? Which means he does dunk on his enemies or the people who come for him, right? And harass him with BS conspiracy theories. He does an incredible job of using those moments to be incredibly detailed and very precise, while also extremely funny, explaining the truth versus the rumor. And when he does that, because he's kind of earned a reputation for being somebody good at this, his content will get shared by people who see themselves as having the crowd, if you will, around him sees an opportunity to amplify truth, to amplify honesty, to push back by helping this person who is A, an expert, and B, also has just a very innately fantastic way of communicating. They want to help him get his message out. And this is the sort of thing where I do think that public health authorities, they recognize this now, kind of. Like, this is the time to really be pushing for that sort of transparent, frequent, and engaging conversation. I think it's actually critical to institutional resilience, and to
public health.
Yeah, exactly.
So before bird flu becomes airborne, public health people, get on the stick. Find yourself some good communicators. Well, with that, Renée DiResta, thank you so much. The book is called Invisible Rulers, and it is a guidebook for how to navigate the world that has made everything so crazy, the factors that have made us so susceptible to bespoke realities. Thanks so much.